Hello, guys.
Welcome. Is it Marcin? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, it's correct. Yes.
I was looking at Joe's time zone in Slack, and it says it's 1 a.m. for him right now. Is he joining us extremely late at his time?
For me, it's right now 7 p.m., so not so bad.
Well, thanks for staying up late for us.
Yeah, important topic.
Apparently getting a lot of people's attention because I'm seeing folks joining today that I don't think normally join our events. So good job for you getting everybody to show up. And my famous question, which Mike Brown do we have today? Is this IBM Mike?
AWS.
AWS. I was wrong.
Mike is IBM. Michael is me. AWS. Edit. Whatever. I'm more than just my company, Brandon.
But until we replace you with a unique Shaw Digest, I can't keep it straight. Here, we'll give folks another 1 or 2 minutes here to show up. A lot of folks have a habit of showing up around 5 after. But otherwise, yeah, we'll probably turn the floor over to you. And Marcin, are you going to be the one doing the presenting today?
Yes, I will be the one.
Okay. Great.
Maybe I can already share my screen that we have. Can you clear it? Can you see that?
We can see it. It's not
Okay.
in presenter mode or presentation mode, but yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, that looks good. It's a rarity for us to have someone actually pull up a presentation. So that's why everybody's showing up. They want to see this happen. Oh, well, it's 5 after. I will say if you want to go ahead and kick this off, you're the one and only agenda item on our list today. So feel free to take as much time as you need for it.
Okay, cool. So let's start it. So today, together with Joe Huang, we wanted to talk about OCI image compatibility spec. We are both from Huawei, and the problem we are going to discuss doesn't apply to generic containerized applications. It applies to applications that have some special requirements. So the issue is especially visible in multi-cloud environments where you cannot have the same OS builds. Let's assume you have a containerized application from some vendor that has to be distributed across different clouds. You somehow need to know or find out about requirements of this containerized application, and that could be done over compatibility spec. So you can see here the diagram of this example, but not only multi-cloud scenarios might be problematic. You have an application that has to describe the requirements to run correctly, even in a private cloud. We have to come up with a standard specification to describe those needs that are understandable by different vendors and user. So one of the real example is shown here on the picture, that author of the app has to inform the user that his container requires kernel 5.7 or higher for write protected huge page faults feature. And also we came up with some different real requirements, like kernel module requirements, like some applications require prem scheduling. So also this has to be described in the compatibility spec. For instance, virtualization case is also a good example of that. I'm not sure if you are familiar with KubeVirt, but KubeVirt allows you to run virtual machine on Kubernetes. So Virt Launcher pods, the image requires KVM module loaded on the worker node, and it could also be described over the image, over the compatibility spec. Some device driver requirements, like in tree drivers, VFIO, if some containerized application needs this VF token that is introduced in kernel 5.7, it's necessary that this feature is there, right, with the specific kernel. The same for out-of-tree drivers like NVIDIA, which is often problematic, that if the CUDA library version inside is different than driver released on the host, then you have a problem. And as Nathan mentioned in Slack, the same applies to API, right, that can cross into containers and cause some problems. So just wanted to, over these examples, show you that the issue is real. And Joe came up with a document that describes in detail some use cases and can be found under this link. You have the link to the presentation, so I think you can find it yourself. And what others also, because this problem is not new, right? There are several blog posts about containers compatibility, and there is a nice blog post from IBM and cool statements like describing that a lot of time containers work, they do until they don't. And this applies to generic containers, like they don't have a problem with portability and compatibility, but we have a problem with specialized containers that require several or specific kernel versions or kernel drivers or kernel modules. And another statement that is quite obvious, saying that Linux containers are just regular processes, so it comes with the same portability and compatibility issues. And then what we discovered with Joe is that image spec tries to cover these requirements to some extent over OS version and OS feature fields. Unfortunately, or fortunately, OS version is a string type that doesn't allow to specify more than one version. That's not good for us. And OS features support officially only one feature Win32K, and there is no feature list for Linux. Also, there is no validation tool. I guess OS features can get any, because it's a map, as I saw in the struct, so you can put there any features you like, but it has to be understood by various vendors. So it would be nice if we can specify some list of possibilities in here. And yeah, and then I come with some reasoning why we really need that. Like if you have some cloud operators or support engineering, and they have to find out about containers requirements, they have to often do it the hard way. They have to run the container on the host, see over logs if everything is fine, if container is crashing or not, and so on. And I think we could make it much more easier if we specify this image compatibility spec. And also, it's not possible, like often not possible, that you can ship your build, OS build across different cloud providers. That kind of is pain in the ass in here, and it's not always possible or supported by cloud providers. So we came with this statement that OCI does very well, this governs portability, but not fully describes compatibility. And if we define both stuff, portability and compatibility, we will make much easier supportability for cloud vendors or cloud operators that run multiple cloud Also, that would be a source of truth for everybody to know the container requirements, so that, for example, operator or automation could read compatibility spec, reconfigure worker nodes, and maybe deploy their applications, adjust basically the requirements. And it could also be adapted by different container runtimes. Like I could imagine in here, this is just an example. Like over Docker run, you can pass some argument to validate compatibility, or write some kind of plugin that helps you to validate those. Or as if we ship a compatibility spec over artifact, this is open to discussion, and maybe we'll talk about that in the next slides. Or over XCTL to I don't know, read this compatibility spec itself. Also, we could move a little bit further with Kubernetes scheduler itself, because these days, if you have some application that requires something specific, like kernel drivers or something, you have to create a pod and adjust this over node selectors, maybe pod affinity presets and pod topology spans constraint and so on. Kubernetes has those mechanisms already, but it would be good also to improve that maybe Kubernetes scheduler could read this compatibility spec and make scheduling decision based on that as an addition. I'm not saying to replace node selector or already advanced mechanisms for scheduling in Kubernetes world, but this has to be taken to Kubernetes community to discuss. It's just an example how this could influence Kubernetes itself. And we also came up with some frequently asked questions. We had a question that it might be hard to describe the whole requirements for application and why we should do that. This is true, but we are not talking here about generic applications that don't have special requirements. We only want to provide this compatibility spec for applications that need that, like specific kernel version, like with this huge pages example or so. And we really would like to create this standard under OCI scope that is like one source of truth, well defined, and can be applied by multiple vendors instead of creating somewhere in some repo external standards that that wouldn't be maybe adopted by others. So it's very important that we have unified standard that is acceptable by everybody. And there are some related questions, but maybe not 100%, asking why not rebuild the container image for a specific cloud provider? Because most of the time it's better to have unified image that can be distributed across different cloud providers. And also, if you rebuild the container image, like for example for RHEL, you have this UBI base image, it also doesn't solve all problems. So it's just different a little bit matter. And there's also a question, why not to upgrade production operating system to the newest version? Because this also doesn't solve your issues. If you have a cluster, very big clusters, with various applications with different like requirements, like maybe some legacy applications require kernel 4.5 and they will break with newer kernel, then you have a problem. And the point in here is also coordinating the upgrade in such environment might be difficult if you have applications from different vendors. But the point in here is that upgrading system to the newest version doesn't solve everything. And the other question, why not to have a unified platform across cloud providers like OpenShift with RHEL? For instance, you can have OpenShift with RHEL images on Azure, AWS, and so on. But it means for organizations that they are vendor locked. So it's better and easier to come with some unified standards. And I think I answered this question already, that why not to use custom OS images and distribute them across different cloud providers. Also, it means, it's not always possible because cloud provider might not support to have a custom images. Maybe big players, they support like Google Cloud, Amazon, Azure, and so on. But you have also different smaller cloud providers, I don't know, maybe Hetzner and others. So yeah, and the other side of that, it would be very hard to support multiple build OS just for groups of applications. I think that's not the way for many organizations. And there is last question that on the previous slide I mentioned Kubernetes scheduler improvement, if it's not good enough. What I stated already, it is good enough, but maybe we could optionally improve it to influence the scheduling decision based on the image compatibility spec, that would be something cool. And I think that's the whole presentation I have for today. That's showing the problem. And we wanted to discuss with you guys, what do you think about this problem, how we could move forward, and if it would be okay to create image compatibility working group to discuss various solutions.
Cool. I'm never opposed to another working group. I think this would make sense as well as just a lot of thought being put into a pull request against probably image spec. So I can go either way. There's where I'm saying is that if we made a working group for it, it would probably end up being a working group that just has a commit to one project.
Mm-hmm. Because we discuss internally some different options that maybe image compatibility spec could be delivered as an artifact, a special artifact under OCI, just like an idea. We didn't come with very detailed proposal for that, but also we considered extending platform spec, but it means you would have to, each time the requirement changes, you would have to rebuild the image, and delivering this over artifact, it would bring you more flexibility, let's say, but we would have to come up with new artifact type and keep some spec for that, and bring some validation tools for it. That's why we thought maybe it's good to create a working group to gather people, discuss this, and go with the best idea.
Yeah. My knee-jerk reaction, if I was to try to implement a solution on this, we've got a line, I added it a while back, not necessarily for this, but it falls in nicely for it. In the index manifest, that if you see multiple platforms or just multiple descriptors in general in that manifest list that match your requirements as a runtime, that you're supposed to pick the first one. And what that means is you can make a generic image out there that has your lowest common denominator, something that should run on every environment, but maybe just not efficiently, might run poorly, doesn't have all the features turned on, all the bells and whistles. And that would get listed up front as the first one. That means that you've got the option for all the rest of the descriptors for that same OS, for the same platform and everything else in there, to put some fields in there that you recognize with your runtimes to pick and choose later on that says, hey, I'm a runtime for this. I could use the more generic platform, but I see something I like better down below. And the places you have to work with that are the platform field where we've got stuff like the features, that's array of strings. I think you do a lot with that. And the other spot that you can work with is annotations. And so either one of those, you've got flexibility to kind of build a solution on this. And the question is, what does a good solution look like with those two things? Or do we have to go for some third thing and build something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that. I'm thinking about annotations because we considered that in the past. I'm not sure if annotations would be the best way to describe compatibility. That's my initial thought about that. We would have various ideas probably. We have to think about that, but we just need to, start preparing some proposals and be aligned with you guys. What's okay with you and what's not okay with you, and try to find the best idea. So my thought for the next steps would be to send a mail on the mailing list. Maybe ping more people because maybe some more folks are interested in that. And from there, we can move with some next steps, see what works.
Yeah, if you go the working group route, the next step, in addition to dropping a mail just to get people's attention,
Okay.
I would probably start with a pull request over to TOB or TRC. Never keep track of our acronyms over here. But we do have open containers. Over here, someone's going to correct me or answer me before I finally get to it. And it is TO, where is it? TOB, Technical Oversight Board, not a committee. We've got a kind of a template you'll be able to see from other people who've been setting it up over here. Oh, we've got TOCs in other places too. Just depends. But yeah, we've got examples of how we have spun this up. I'm going to try to find an example here so I can share it. So here's the latest one for auth. Now I can even share it on the big screen. Everybody. I say big screen, I put it on my small screen, but it's because it's easier for folks here to see. Yeah, so we've got a pull request somewhat template. You just found one. We've only had a couple out there. And so the auth is the most recent one we just spun up. And there is a file that you drop into the proposals directory. And if you fill something like this out, we can go back and forth on it over there in terms of what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And these files, as I look at them, probably easier to look at something that's already filled out in here. And now you can understand why you get so many tabs. But we've got a couple of different working groups over here. And so auth and the reference types we did before that, where we just say, you know, here's what we're doing, here's the purpose, define a scope, what's out of scope, what you think you're going to create. And I suspect in this one, it's just going to be a pull request to the image spec for you. And then the trick is then to start selling this folks and get some buy-in on it, get people that are interested in it. So that would be a good first step if you want to go that route. And then from there, I would say once that issue is opened up to, once the pull request is opened up, to start pitching that over on the mailing list as well. And we're pretty good on the Slack, but the mailing list gets a few people that aren't paying attention on the Slack.
Okay, great. Great to hear. I will go follow that road. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I say, my knee-jerk reaction, and let me see if I can get this thing out of the way so I can click on other buttons, is in the image index, there is that line in here that just says, hey, if you've got multiple things that match, you should use the first one. And that's kind of been the fail-safe for everybody that wants to invent something new. When they say we want to make a new image type but not break all the existing images and all the existing runtimes out there, this kind of gives us our escape hatch where anybody that does something like that, just make it the second or third or whatever image in the list of the manifest list after whatever else the client should find and match on the normal use case. And then newer clients that have newer functionality can pick and choose from the other ones they see if they like better.
Understood. Cool.
Yeah, and then from that, features is reserved, which means we can use it, but might need some discussion on there. OS features, though, that one, we've only defined one thing for right now, but that doesn't mean you can't always add more.
Yeah, definitely. I think over time we will figure out how to use it the best way, and we will find, the best specification that works for everybody.
I think a lot of this is to try to work through what are all the different variables you're going to have. And when you look at that, like a lot of the spec right now says that if you see something you don't recognize, you can ignore it. And you're in the reverse case, and you're not the only one dealing with this problem. I've seen this over from runtime right now where they're facing. We've got a feature that if you turn on some ID mapping capabilities they've got over there, that you can't ignore this. A runtime can't just ignore it and run off and do its own thing because that causes all kinds of breakage. And so I think you've got the same problem where you could have a feature list and maybe you recognize two of the features and you say, oh, great, I know how to do those two. If you don't recognize the third feature, that doesn't mean you should just go ahead and run that image anyway, because it might mean that third feature was a critical capability you don't have and can't run this image.
Yeah, exactly.
Jordan, I see you jumping on video here. Did I key up something with the ID map kind of stuff?
Well, I mean that is, I guess, one of the issues is, the negative confirmation issue, I guess, like just from an architectural standpoint, because if you have something that's security critical, and this image is obviously incorrect, it's not just that things may break, but it is incorrect and will misbehave in potentially dangerous ways. But actually what I wanted to just zoom back out on is to try to determine what concrete problems people are solving. So I guess, the whole container is just a process is, both kind of taking the easy way out, but it's also the way it's always been, is that generally, how would I put it? To have portable software in a Linux environment, if you need certain kernel features that are not widespread, where I think widespread is generally considered to be present in all currently maintained distributions that have a population of, say, more than 1,000 users, tends to be a pretty good benchmark for that. You generally have to test that they're there. Generally assuming that certain kernel features are present is usually considered to be, buggy user space software, and a specific concern when adding new kernel interfaces is often how can user space test for availability or test for compatibility, or even if a certain behavior change has to be made in a way that some user space, but not all of user space, might notice, allowing user space to detect it is usually a consideration. So I guess my thought is just, the obvious use case here is out of tree things like the NVIDIA drivers, but that is where I start to think that, this is just me having like an old school Linux packaging background, but that's where I begin to feel things are a little fraught. Because anything that's out of tree is really slippery and hard to reason about. It's, both that out of tree patch series often make breaking changes or are subtly incompatible or even hard to version when there's competing versions of the same patch set on LKML, to you do have well-defined, long-lived out of tree patch sets like the NVIDIA driver shims, or and then the matching binary drivers, or you have, I don't know, like the CK patch series, the Zen patch series, ZEN Zen, not the hypervisor. But even in those cases, those out of tree patch series often do things that are, how would I put it? If they had been accepted in mainline, the aggressive refactoring or incompatibilities that often happen in those patch series never would have been accepted in mainline. So even reasoning about those and trying to say that this has a distinct identity of, I'm just going to pick on CK because, I don't know, say your application decides it needs Concalibus's CPU scheduler for some reason. Even assigning a strong identity to something like that, of like a single patch tree published by a single kernel developer that's well known, is really slippery, I think. Like I guess what I'm wondering is, so are there use cases for this where it makes sense and it's not better done the traditional way on a Linux system with the mainline kernel? And if not, if this is primarily to support out of tree features, does it belong in the core specification, or does it make more sense as a convention among cloud providers or something, like something that is auxiliary, like a series of annotations or something? Like does that make sense? Because like in my mind, for this to have value, it really needs to add value on top of the kernel, Linus's tree, and not just out of tree patches that don't have a strong identity or strong continuity. The basically out of tree patches almost never make the same guarantees that Linus's tree does. And so, trying to it feels like there's a lot weaker argument for adding a new concept to the specification if it doesn't work for mainline Linux, if it's not useful for consumers of the upstream kernel.
Well, how to answer that first? Like, I think I get your point, but in my opinion, it's not only useful for out of tree stuff. In telco, you have a lot of legacy applications that have special requirements or specialized applications that rely on certain features of the kernel itself, right? And you might require a specific kernel version. For example, you might have telco application that works well on kernel 4.5, but breaks on kernel 5.15 or so. I know it's a problem of the application itself, but if you move applications around different cloud providers, you need to have some kind of information, like of the requirements, like of the application itself. My point is, containers, in my opinion, that are specialized applications in containers, they should have some kind of possibility to describe their requirements, right? And
well, I feel like maybe then, just to cut in there 1 second. So you're saying like, so say that like that example I think is a little weird, because if you have something that works on kernel 4.5 breaks on kernel 4.15, that is definitionally
5.15, because kernel doesn't, for example, doesn't promise you that compatibility between major changes, right? Major version.
No, the major version of the kernel means nothing. It's Linus ran out of fingers and toes. Like that's an important thing to understand. So if that compatibility break did happen, that would be generally a severe regression in user space with limited exceptions. There are things that explicitly are not part of the stability contract with user space. Some of those are highly contentious right now. Examples would be, for example, like BPF hooks. Whether or not those are stabilized is something that is currently a big pain point in kernel development land. But most things that most applications care about, if it was to regress like that, that would be how would I put it? There would be certain infamous emails being retread on LKML. But so what I want to highlight is that maybe you're coming at this from the wrong angle, because if it is something, so the subtlety of Linux packaging and distributions is that distribution kernels are often amalgamates of a kernel that was near current when the distribution was branched off, plus many, many backports. The Debian kernel is guilty of this. The Red Hat kernel is guilty of this. They're often referred to as Franken kernels because they're kind of a little bit of mystery meat, usually without looking really closely at the sources. It's hard to reason about, okay, so what does a Red Hat 3.14 have in it? Does it have this feature? Does it have this fix? But I do wonder if, like, the concern is portability between cloud providers and similar, maybe it makes more sense to reason in terms of the underlying Linux distribution and not the kernel version. What I'm trying to get at is that kernel version comparisons, Brian just said it, kernel version comparisons are utterly meaningless, which is why the stance for a very long time has been that you need to feature detect the kernel you're running on, because my 5.4 is not necessarily your 5.4. If I'm running, say, a Ubuntu hardware enablement kernel, and you're running, I don't know, Red Hat 9. I'm pulling these versions out of midair. I don't remember what base kernel versions they're using. But the point is that you can have wildly different kernels with similar version numbers, which is why it has always also been distribution best practice to suffix the packager name into the kernel version. So, you'll see like an EL8 on a Red Hat 8 kernel. You'll see a Ubuntu 1 on a Ubuntu kernel. So if you're trying to reason about like compatibility with the underlying base OS that your user land is a guest on, it might make more sense to try to reason in terms of either you have to come up with granularity and start describing kernel features or even specific patches with some sort of names and identifiers and potentially even versioning. Or you have to you have to do what everybody else has done, which is they reason in terms of Linux distribution, which is why, right, like certain software is only supported, like the vendor may only support it on Red Hat, not because it won't correctly work elsewhere, but because they only test it against the amalgamation of patches on the Red Hat kernel, and therefore that's the only thing that their support can reasonably guarantee compatibility with beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
So like what I'm saying is that I think the kernel version is a really fraught road to go down, and generally software should be trying to test the kernel it's on. But if you need, that's another good example, Brandon. If you like having to reason about compiler features by feature testing the compiler in real time. But yeah, if you need stronger guarantees than you're able to get by testing at runtime, at the very least, reasoning about the whole operating system is probably a more productive, cohesive unit to try to reason about than the kernel, because the kernel version is not very indicative of much. Is ultimately what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I get your point. I get your point in that, but I also think, okay, I could agree with that, like your perspective, but reality and the whole industry of we are working with in telco shows something different, right? The way how people are treating this kind of issues, and I also thinking like leaving this kernel versioning. I also thinking, for example, for problems like what kind of kernel modules has to be loaded on the operating system. Like, for example, with this virtual machines example, right? That Vue Launcher image needs to have this set of kernel modules loaded. And yeah, that could be also a good example why do we need this kind of stuff. What do you think about that?
My comment, for example, if we specify the container application is compatible with some Linux distribution, even for the same distribution, there are different combination. For example, for IHEL, the real-time kernel is not installed by default. If the application is running with the real-time requirement, you have to reconfigure the OS so that the real-time kernel could be work in the host OS, but not for the general OS, general kernel. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is where not reasoning about version, but reasoning about actual abstractions that the kernel has might be something that's possible. So for example, reasoning about kernel config options or kernel modules being loaded, I think is very doable. At least that's my initial reaction. I mean, there's plenty of prior art to that. It's not trying to invent something totally new either. So like that strikes me as less fraught. Where it gets really like the thing that gets really fraught to me is when you're trying to reason about like, oh, so I need a version of the kernel that has openat2 that supports this flag. Alexa's not here. But you know, or something like that, or like, oh, I need I mean, here's a good example I've been working with the other day. I need a kernel version that has a VFS that supports this operation that is needed to make the overlay file system driver module work. There's not, I've just been going through this where there's not a good way to reason from kernel version, like, oh, hey, is especially with an out of tree module that I'm trying to feature test ZFS for compatibility with overlay FS. There's not a good way to reason about that beyond feature testing, but just because of how the kernel is developed and architected, I guess I'm not necessarily sure that there is anything missing there, that it makes sense to try to invent that if that's not something that upstream has. Like in that case, I would say that like you have to feature test for it and fall back or bail out. But what does make sense to me, at least, is like if you say like, okay, so we need SE Linux or this certain kernel module or whatnot. I mean, that is an abstraction that is exported by the kernel. The kernel doesn't guarantee that modules will never go away, but the kernel does guarantee that modules are a concept that exists, that they have well-defined names, and that they can be tested for that they're present or not. Whereas, you know, does this certain system call support this flag without actually testing that? The kernel doesn't have any abstraction which indicates that or doesn't indicate that. Version number is utterly meaningless. And so, you know, the only real meaningful way for any userland software to reason about that, you know, with what upstream provides is to feature test. And then, you know, because that is sometimes more complicated than people would like. I mean, that is where we get to like the abstraction of Linux distributions. I mean, ultimately, you know, what we're talking about here is kind of once again like the pain points of running a foreign userland on a kernel that it was not originally built with, intended for, and all of the fun that can come along with that. Like this is very similar to OpenVZ and LXC woes over the, like, you know, this is a problem that goes back 25 years at this point. But, you know, is maybe something that's more present in people's minds as they're trying to abstract more over the underlying compute in a cloud environment.
Yeah, I mean, I get your argumentation. I mean, kernel versioning was one of them, and out of tree drivers and kernel modules is the other one. So what I would like to do is, from this meeting, I would like to go with this pull request and continue the discussions on the pull request and see if we find consensus or not about that, if that's fine by you.
I mean, if you're asking me, I hold no power here other than being interested. But I mean, yeah, by all means, I think that is if that's the model you want to go with, that is the process to move things forward, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, let's form some kind of working group. If this doesn't make sense, that community doesn't want this, then we can you know, openly discuss that. But I hope they need. So yeah, I would just follow that path in that case.
And I think I'm looking through the attendee list here to see. I think we've got maybe one other person that's on the TRB right now. So the pull request is going to be the way to get their attention.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely think you want to pull in as much expertise as you can. There's some people who have lots of Linux packaging and software distribution experience, as well as getting more representation from the hyperscalers who presumably are kind of the target audience for this, to actually reason whether or not it solves a problem for them. And if we can try to balance not creating unmaintainable abstractions, I am looking at like I don't know how much fun you've had with packaging Linux software, but I'm looking at things like attempts in the Python world to define a common userland with a common set of certain symbols and shared objects that are available and whatnot, to allow for universal Linux binaries that are dynamically linked. And how fraught a project that's been. That's the Many Linux, if you want to go look at that as kind of similar-ish prior art, as well as I mean, just Linux packaging in general. But I mean, hopefully the tension of like, this would be very convenient in the cloud, and not inventing something like Many Linux that ultimately is just extremely painful for everybody and is the distraction that leaks is possible.
Yeah, definitely. I get your point.
Yeah. To extend on my comment there, we did a few things on the Windows side back in the day that people are regretting today. So the fewer of those we recreate, the better.
Oh yeah, that the OS dot version of the OS dot features there is going, oh yeah, those are really bad examples to look at because they're really horrible Windowsism.
But they're a nice field that anybody can put anything into. We just don't know how to use it. Anybody else have opinions on this one that wants to jump in? Okay, nothing else there. I'm going to throw a last minute item on the list here since we have folks here. And it is not in any way, I'll even do a screen share. Not looking for an answer, but I'm just looking for more attention on the issue. Because I don't like things being just me having all the conversation. And y'all are a quiet group all the time. So, and that 459, I think is the one I linked to. Let's see. Yeah. So this is the one where the request came in last week to allow registries to reject the non-existing subjects. And this was one that we had put in there as a requirement when we were defining how the refers API was working. And I think folks are trying it out now and realizing that they don't like it when the end users are defining things that the registry operators had to support. To which I say, shucks, they should have come and joined us in our discussion earlier. But we're past that point now. So I wanted to raise this one up, get some more attention on this to make sure everyone saw it and have opinions if you have opinions. And if you don't have opinions, that's okay too.
At least in this case, Brandon, I'm one of those people going, shuck, should have brought this up sooner. But it appears to have been a matter of timing of it kind of flying under the radar. And then, more or less, I reviewed the discussion that was mostly you talking on the YouTube recording, and it was mostly kind of, well, this would be very convenient for clients. So if nobody objects, it seems safe enough. But I mean, is there more that we can say on this one that wasn't discussed last week? Like, I'm happy to talk about it since I am ultimately the person who brought this up, but I'm just not sure that there's more that I can say right now that isn't captured in Derek's issue.
Yeah, I think both of us have kind of done a good description of each of the different points we have here. And so I think the idea is just to get a better feel for the general community of who wants what here and what makes the most sense. I get the concern that if you're looking at it as a Merkle tree, that what we put in the artifact has a subject field. That subject field is a descriptor. You follow that down, and the idea of the Merkle tree, everything in there, we've always said that, hey, registries can do some validation there. The challenge comes in of how we use that field, and the way we're using that field in the inverse causes a lot of complications down the road for other people that want to have some kind of guarantees on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least in my mind here, I think that it's better to leave the possibility of a strongly what would I call it, like a strongly validated, a strongly linked registry graph, or to leave it to registries to not do that. I think ideally we're not, it's because essentially, you know, if we mandate a weekly linked graph, we're essentially mandating the data model registry, and even some of the implementation details. So at least in my mind, like it feels convenient to potentially create some guarantees for clients by being restrictive here, but I think that that is a bit more prescriptive than necessarily a specification for interoperability should be, because of the burdens it imposes on the implementation. And if those guarantees need to be provided for clients, that should be something that is kind of explicitly thought out and provided another way. Like it does feel a little bit like this was a kind of like, hey, here's a neat thing. Wouldn't it be convenient if? Like, does that make sense? It's kind of something that can come along for the ride rather than being a discrete concept.
Yeah, I think if I was to redo the whole refers API a day, I would probably, one second. Sorry about that. If I was to redo the refers API a day, I think I would have a much stronger interest in trying to implement it just with HTTP headers and not even put it into the manifest at all. And yeah, one of those things looking at it, hindsight 2020. Since we've already got it in the manifest, the question is, how are people using it? And does that strongly typed guarantee really make sense for that one field? And I think that's where I'm looking to get a bigger response from the community of, is that something you really need for registries to function? And is it something that's needed for clients on their side? Does it break use cases and things like that? I can
I'm also
definitely see it
wondering.
breaking. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, like, you know, if we can be specific about the guarantees we're trying to provide to clients, because we did observe last week that you can use the push content then tag workflow to prevent content from being live before you have confirmed that everything is as you want it to be. You know, aka like the refers are populated. So you have your signatures or whatever other sidecar data you're pushing that's associated with an image before you tag it, and it might be discovered. Is there I mean, and then, you know, there's the sidebar on a true transactional up, like you can create something that's semi-transactional that way, but a true transactional multi-part upload API potentially being useful future work. Is there a guarantee that we're looking for clients that can't be created that way? And I see you're scrolling down your comment here, so maybe I didn't read it closely enough.
Yeah. So thinking about that from the tagging thing, because yeah, if we deferred it, my thought was, hey, you might solve the first one there, which is one of the scenarios that, hey, you could always tag out the fact. But I had a bunch of different use cases I was thinking about how people try to implement this in terms of they might be trying to cache some responses back from the registry. And if they know the registry always does things in certain orders, there are challenges if they can't assume that when they see the image that it's finished. And so if I'm doing something like doing the copying between one registry to another, you know, some of the synchronization tooling, once I see a digest on the registry, if I know that I'm always copying the refers first, then I'm done. If I don't know that, then every single copy I have to do a full recursive check of everything to make sure that nothing got missed. And that guarantee that the refers got copied first is something that's going to come down to individual implementations saying, hey, we can guarantee this. But if they do that, it can have a massive performance improvement on how tools are interoperating with registries.
Wouldn't you still need knowledge of the guarantees the registry provides? Like I'm thinking of the case of, like, say a tag mutates, or addition, like, or say that there's like, wouldn't you still have to rewalk in certain cases unless the registry provides some guarantees around immutability and completeness that are not captured even in this more restrictive version of the spec?
I do need a guarantee, but not from the registry, but from the content producer. And so the content producer would have to say, when we push a manifest, we push it entirely in its complete state when it's first uploaded, and we're not going to change after the fact. once I have the digest,
Yeah.
the digest is, the tag can always change to a different digest, and I'm good there. But I need a guarantee from the person that actually created it. And so, if you're the person that creates it, then you can make guarantee to yourself. If this is coming
Well,
from
so
an
that's what I'm
official
kind of
image,
wondering is
Yeah.
if there's an externality there, which is this social contract, this soft guarantee, then do you really gain that much? If you can't make that assumption across the board, if you have to discover it externally, it feels like kind of a micro optimization for that case where you might already have to have a whitelist of images that this applies to or similar. And then likewise, I don't think that there's anything that relaxing the language. If it's no longer a must, there are still registries that can enforce that all signatures are uploaded first, etc., or that all of the content must be uploaded before a tag is assigned or similar. You can still allow that. You have to discover it externally. It's not guaranteed by the spec. There's not a way in the spec right now to discover that, like a header or something, where you can discover what the registry's policy is. However, it's still external to the specification, right? Like even in the case of keeping the must language, it sounds like those guarantees are partially predicated on communication.
You raise a big concern though, which is the challenge that I'm really worried about is if we say that registries may reject that. You got one person with a hot mic there. The challenge that I'm looking at is that if we say that registries may reject this, that clients are going to say, well, for portability, I'm always going to push signatures after. And that means any registry that wants to implement something that says you must support this, it's just not going to work because no clients are going to support it.
I mean, yeah, I think that comes back around to kind of the mandating certain things on the registry makes it easier to implement the client, or it's even, I think, kind of implicitly prescribing some behavior, I guess, here for clients as well. Yeah, I mean, would it be horrible to give guidance on, some registries may support this and here's how you might want to do it? I mean, because I understand the concern of, like, for example, if some registries want to create stronger guarantees based around uploading artifacts first, that if some artifacts want to create stronger guarantees around uploading artifacts first, in a world where clients don't realize that that's something they might want to do and what that flow looks like, there's a discoverability challenge. But could that be solved perhaps by explicitly enumerating different cases in the spec, giving a little bit of guidance there? I mean, I'm just thinking from the registry implementer standpoint, it still strikes me that the burden of a client having try uploading signatures first and then fall back, for example, or even growing a concept of different upload modes is still less burdensome than having to re-architect an entire data model or be willfully out of compliance.
I got one person with a hot mic there. The name says rename this. You can check your mic.
Does anybody have the power to mute them, maybe?
I can. I need to log out first to do that.
But yeah, I guess what I'm saying, Brandon, is that, like, one of your comments here is, ideally, if I know the source always includes all of the metadata before pushing an image, then I can do a head request. But even with the more restrictive language, that's not necessarily guaranteed. Like, you have to know that externally ahead of time. You have to out of channel fashion be able to make a reasonable assumption that that's true, which is where I wonder if it really is worth the burden on registries if you clients still have to have some out of band knowledge, even if this was mandated.
Battery 70%. Connected to peanut butter and jelly. Successfully disconnected. Ready to pair another device.
Okay. And now everybody knows I got a green screen. Sorry about that. Okay, I was a little bit distracted there for a second.
I think we're running out of time in this week's call, and I think, I mean, I still feel like we're mostly retreading things from the issue and the call last week. So hopefully more people have opinions here, and it's not just the same couple people.
Yeah, that
I mean,
was my
really,
biggest
especially
goal.
other registry implementers. I think having opinions on what implications this has or doesn't have for implementations of registries, and how quantifying how big that burden is, having more than one opinion on that would be nice, I think.
Yeah, my big goal of bringing it up again was that I was hoping we could get other registries and other clients as well, because I can see, I think Cosign has implemented this, assuming they do a push first. I think I saw at least one registry operator that's saying they're going to reject that sort of thing. So I see this happening, both sides kind of going different directions, and I'd like to see us find some way to find that happy middle ground somewhere in there. And right now, all the clients came first, and we threw our stuff in the spec, and then the registry folks came along afterwards and said, oh, wait, no, we don't like that. So I don't think that's a good solution either. Well, now, if nothing else, I know I need to sign in with the other account earlier in the meeting, so I don't have to do a quick last minute change there. I think that was all I wanted to put on the agenda. Anybody else have last minute items before we run off? All right. Well, nothing else. Have a great rest of the week, and see you again. And thanks again for the presentation. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, guys. So talk to you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.